My name's Clemens. I'm a product designer, and I've been at N26 for almost coming up to 2 years.
And I'm Omkar. I'm from the Android team at N26. I've been there since about 2.5 years, almost 3 years now.
Cool. So at N26, we're trying to build the bank that the world loves to use. And because we're a mobile bank, and we don't have any physical actual locations, our mobile platforms really have to be top-notch, the products that we ship, so iOS and Android. And when I joined, we were super small. We've almost tripled in size, basically. And as we grow and we build more products, we needed a way to enable designers and engineers to actually build consistently great products on all of our platforms. And that's kind of what we're going to be trying to talk about today, about our design system. And we're going to kind of split it up into 3 main parts. The first being kickoff, so kind of where we were, what the status quo was on all of our platforms, so design, Android and iOS, and kind of how we got started. Then moving to the foundation, so research we did, how we then actually started building this system and shipped it to our designers and engineers. And then looking at a future outlook, so what we're currently working on and what's coming up in the next couple months. And I want to start with why. So why design systems? And more specifically, why now in the context of N26? So like I said, when I joined, we were significantly smaller than we are now. We were about 15 designers and front-end engineers. We were about a design team of maybe 5 product designers. It was super small. And it was pretty easy to maintain consistency across our products that we were building. In the last couple of years, though, we've obviously ballooned, and we've gotten a lot bigger. So now we're about 80 designers and front-end engineers. And then it becomes a little bit more tricky to actually stay consistent. It's a lot more people to deal with. We have a lot of people coming on board every month, and it just becomes a little bit more of a problem. And on that, when I started, we were only in Berlin. We had 1 office, and it was pretty easy. You could walk past some product designers' desks and ask, hey, what was the decision behind this? What about this? And just stay consistent across all our products. But again, since then, early last year, we opened an office in New York. We have some teams set up over there working on products. Late last year, we came to Barcelona here, have our first office here, building a couple products. And at the end of this year, we're also going to be moving to Vienna. So we're also not just working in one office anymore. We're in different countries. We're in different time zones. We have to enable them somehow to build these consistent products. So a couple months ago, roughly 6 months ago, this whole thing got started. And the kind of daunting question was kind of, where do we actually start? There's obviously design systems that are really well established. If we look at Airbnb, for example, and you look at them and you idolize them and you're like, oh, they're so good. Where do you even start as a company if you haven't started it yet? And Roy has already mentioned this in the last talk, but design systems are a product. So this is one thing that we learned quite early on, that it's a product. Because it is a product, it can fail, which sounds really gloomy and really bad, but it can. And this can be down to a couple of different reasons. So imagine a situation, you've built this V1 of your design system, and you've shipped it to all of your engineers and designers, and you're super hyped about it, and everybody's excited, but then no one uses it, and then it just kind of stays stalemate, and it doesn't serve its purpose. So low adoption is a reason why it can fail. Another one is low understanding. If you've shipped it, there's no documentation, no one knows how to use it, it also won't be adopted. And the third is also low support. So again, you've shipped this first version, but then no one knows how to contribute, or you just don't get any further and don't build any more components, and it just stays at V1. Again, it can fail. So we kind of had this in mind and thought, okay, we really don't want this to fail, so how can we actually make sure that it doesn't? So we sat down with our product teams, with our designers, managers, engineers, and we kind of worked out a couple of these pain points that we were having, and a couple of concerns, hopes and fears that these teams had when working with the design system. And there are a couple of things that kind of stood out, 3 mainly. So the first being, it had to be the best and easiest option for designers and engineers to use. So if the design system isn't as easy to use as building your own custom things for each product, then there's no reason anyone would actually use it. The other one was documentation. So everyone needs to understand when to use what, how to use it, and actually how to build with it. And the third was because we're building a bank that the world loves to use, we wanted it to be inclusive and accessible from the ground up. So not just thinking of accessibility as an afterthought, but actually baking it in from the very beginning. So really what I want to get out here is to do your research. So really take time and actually know what you're building before you actually run ahead and build it. Because a design system isn't a one-fits-all kind of thing. It's going to be tailored to your needs as a company and as a team. So we had these learnings, and we set out and we said, OK, we can audit and see kind of what the status quo is and work from there. So we sat down with some designers, and we looked and we had some colors, we had some text styles, we had a few components, but not really much documentation. So we basically had a sketch file with a couple things in it, to be honest. And we thought, OK, we kind of have something going here. So we went to the iOS team and kind of asked them to do an audit. And they had a lot of colors. No text styles, really. They had a couple components, but again, no documentation.
On the Android side of things, though, things were a bit different. I mean, we had the first precursor of a primitive design system, but it was just based on Android. So we had a lot of colors, which were defined in a common place for everyone to use. We had several text styles that we used across the whole app very consistently. We had some components which were abstractions of common patterns that we saw across the whole app. And we had some documentation in the form of code blocks and everything else. But the main problem was that this design system that we had on Android wasn't consistent across iOS and design. So while it was truly useful, we had a lot of lessons that we learned from it. But it really failed when it came to scaling and scaling across teams, locations, and features.
So we did this audit, learned from it that we probably can't build upon what we already have. So we kind of just scrapped it and said, OK, let's start again. So I want to kind of tell a story from a product that I once worked on, friend referral. And more specifically, this kind of divider line, this outline color. And the situation kind of went like this. An iOS engineer wrote to me on Slack and was like, is this the right gray? And it was a hex code. And I said, oh, it should probably be the one that we used on that other screen, without referencing my sketch file. And then an Android engineer chimed in and was like, oh, I thought it was this one. And then, I went back to my sketch file, not knowing now which one is which. And I had something completely different as well. So even though we're all talking about the same thing, it's actually 3 different colors. And that one divider gray ends up being 3 different ones. So we thought, OK, we really need to fix this problem. And we kind of thought, oh, this might be pretty simple. We'll just, we'll get all our hex codes together and look at our grayscale. And we'll just, give them some namings. We'll just call them from 0 to 100. On the brightness scale, we'll have a bunch of different grays. But then, we showed this to a couple people. And again, this question kind of comes up, which one do we actually use? So there's not really any meaning to these colors. So we created categories on top of this. So divider colors, for example, background colors, button colors. And in this case, this one was divider standard, and it used color gray 90. And you never had to deal with hex codes again. So from that point on, if you wanted to use the stroke color for a divider, all you had to type was color.divider.standard. And this was super helpful because there were none of these conversations anymore about which hex code is it, is this the right one, is it different, and so on and so forth. And this is kind of how we dealt with color. And obviously, there's a lot of other things here. For example, typography, spacing, iconography, shadows, corner radii, opacity layers and stuff. And I could go into mega detail on all of these, but we don't have hours of time. So we dubbed these the fundamentals. And these were the fundamentals of our system. With typography, for example, because we wanted to be accessible, we made sure that on iOS, for example, we aligned all of our typography styles to the native ones so that accessible type, when made bigger and smaller, would react within our app. We did the same for spacing, iconography, and so forth. So our learning from this, because we didn't want to rush it, was to really take your time. Because your whole component library, your whole design system is going to be built on these fundamentals. Color is going to be used everywhere. Shadows are going to be used quite often. Typography is everywhere. So really take your time to nail this down, because if this is spot on, you're going to make your life easier a lot down the line.
Yeah, and about speaking of taking your time, we spent a lot of time analyzing what components we had and what design styles we had across the whole application. And one of the bigger things that we noticed was, and as a bank, one of the main things that you would see in the N26 app is transaction cells like that. So as you can see, you have, on the left, you have an icon. In the middle, you have a main section, which in this case is title and subtitle. And on the right, you have an amount text. And so you can see it's a left, middle, or main, and right component to the cell. A very similar pattern is what you see here. So you have the terms and conditions checkbox, and you have a checkbox on the left. You have your main body in the middle, and you have an empty space on the right. And a very similar pattern can be seen in one of the spaces transactions. So spaces is one of the features in N26 which lets you put some money on the side, and this is one of the transaction items or space transaction items that you can see while using that feature. So over there, we also have a very similar pattern. You have an icon on the left, something in the main, and a checkbox on the right. And if you kind of zoom out and take one step back, you can see that you can really represent all of these three use cases with something like this: a start atom, a main atom, and an end atom. And we call this the three-item container. And when we saw this, when we thought about this, we were like, OK, this is really flexible. This can let us do a lot of things. And this is our Lego set of design systems. And we're really excited about it. We're like, OK, this is the silver bullet for every problem that we have when it comes to design systems, which was great. But then this was the only documentation we had about it. It was lines of code which made sense to engineers, but not necessarily to a designer. And even to an engineer, because we're talking about visual components here, sure, you can read through it, you can understand what's happening, but then there's a lot of cognitive load involved while understanding what the specific component would do. So it was really obvious that we would need some sort of documentation that would not only serve engineers, not only serve designers, but would also be understandable to anyone else who is interested in learning about what this component does and looks like. And therefore, we have the system glossary on the iOS and Android apps. And the glossary is essentially a collection of a showcase of all of the components and all of the fundamentals that we've defined in the design system since its inception. And every time a new component is added, is created, is conceptualized, and implemented, it goes in the glossary for everyone else to see. So diving a bit deeper into the glossary, like I said, we have the fundamentals outlined on the glossary, so typography, color, iconography, spacing, and all of these fundamentals. And more specifically about colors, so the color names, as Clemens mentioned before, have been abstracted to give them more meaningful names. So a developer, while working on a particular feature, doesn't need to know about the actual hex value of the color. They only need to know the abstracted name. And there's one more advantage that this naming convention gives you, that once you decide to add theming to it or change the theme, we can have dark mode really easily. So as a feature engineer, you don't have to worry about supporting dark mode. It's supported right out of the box for you by the design system. Speaking of the three-item container that we saw before, we have a glossary section for that as well, where you can play around with all the possibilities on the left, on the main, and on the right atom of the three-item container. So as an example, we can have a look at the start accessory, and you have a drop-down of all of the possibilities that you have that are possible in the start position. Very similarly, for the main section, so you can choose between how your main section should look like. And similarly, for the end accessory, you have a host of things that you can choose from. So essentially, it's something that you can play around with. It's very flexible. And I think one of the iOS engineers did the math on this. And at the moment, we have 145, 146, something like that, combinations possible out of the three-item container. And of course, not all combinations are valid design components or may not even be used once. But then the possibilities can be endless, and that's what lets us scale with something like this, something as flexible as this. And speaking of the system glossary and the 3-item container, guess what the system glossary is composed of? If you zoom in a bit, you can see all of these elements are actually 3-item containers. So the glossary not only let us showcase our design components in the form of some documentation, but it was also a playground for us to, when we build these components, we were able to try it out on the glossary and see how easy they were to use. Because in the end, ease of use is one of the goals of a good design system. And the glossary let us, as developers and as designers, really let us figure out if the components that we're thinking about, the components that we're building, and the components that we'll propagate tomorrow are easy to use or not. And therefore, the glossary was very valuable to us in the form of documentation and a playground. And that's really the takeaway that we have here, that make it visible in the form of some documentation. And going ahead, where do we go now? Like, we have kicked it off. We've rolled out a few components out in the team. But what happens next? So the first thing that comes to mind is, OK, now that you've kicked it off, how do you evolve this design system? How do you make sure that this doesn't stagnate, this doesn't stay where it is, but still evolves and is adapting to what the company needs at that point? So let's take a simple example. In theory, all of the design of the screens that you get on Zeppelin or whatever tool you use in your company should be 100% compliant with the design system that has been rolled out. But in case you might have some features that might need something outside of the existing design system, for example, a tooltip, which is currently not in the design system. What happens here? So we have a contribution process in place where any feature that requires a new component that's not there in the library has to get it approved from the design team or from the design system team. And they have to have strong arguments about why they need a new component that's not in the existing library. And if the arguments are strong enough, then it has been approved, and then it has to be compliant with the design system. So it goes through a check based on what fundamentals it uses, so typography, color, shadows, spacing, all of these things, and making sure that the component is specified using the existing fundamentals of the design system. And once this is done, once it's design system compliant and ready, it is now ready for implementation. And the engineers who work on the feature that requires this new component are the ones who take some extra time, build this new component or implement this new component on each platform, Android, iOS, and essentially contribute it to the code base of each platform. And anyone else who is building a feature who requires a similar component, they just have to reuse it like a Lego block. And so something like this, like a tooltip, would simply be placed in the layout files where you need. And then the resulting outcome is a tooltip that is design compliant and still respects the platform-specific guidelines of iOS and Android. One of the next steps would be also to have some sort of a middleware or a backend for a front end, which would not only return data, but would actually return entire screens. So the BFF is a separate topic altogether, so I'm not going to go into the details of it. But this is just something that I wanted to show you what's possible with it. So let's say a screen requires a section header and a container that contains 3 checkboxes. So something like this. And on the right, you can see what, let's say, the backend for front end can return. Of course, that's pseudocode, so all the developers don't run after me. And this is how it would be rendered on the Android platform. And the same response will be received by the iOS app and be rendered on the iOS platform using the same design components that have been implemented on the iOS platform. And this is how you achieve consistency across both platforms. And there's only one thing left to say here, so thank you very much for your time and your attention. Thank you.
Okay. So we've got a few questions. Come on over here.
I will come over there.
Cool. Similar maybe to the last session. First question is consistency. How do you maintain it? What do you do? What's the problems and challenges?
It's really, so I would take a step back and say that consistency is not the problem. It's knowing that there's something available that you can use without building it from scratch. So it's a question of really putting it out there and making it visible. So that was one of the takeaways that we also put on the slide, that everything that goes in the design system needs to be visible. And I think for us, we found out that the glossary app is a very good way to make that visible, because we also tried this out in the Android design system, the primitive version of the design system that we had on Android. We also had a glossary app that all of the engineers working on had access to, and all of the designers had access to as well. So, and if you make your new components and all of the entire design system visible in some form or the other in a tangible manner, so that people can not only see how it looks, but how it feels when you touch it, for example, the ripples and things like these. So consistency follows in a very straightforward manner after that.
Cool. An interesting question about sort of localization and internationalization when you see a lot of text on components, or especially when they have different amounts of text in different languages. How do you handle that? Yeah,
so this was a problem that we faced before even building or kicking off or even thinking about a cross-platform design system. Like now, N26 has been active mostly in the Eurozone, but then we've moved to the UK, we're moving to the US now, and more markets to come. So the same information, even within Europe, is displayed maybe differently. Like if it's 1,000 euros, or even, let's say, the date time, right? So locale is a key part of everything that is displayed on the screen. So locale includes not just your language, but also your region. So French in France would probably have a different way of displaying the date than, let's say, French in Canada, North America, right? So these are the two things that every text component in the design system is aware of. And this was something that we've faced as a company way before the design system came in. So we have our ways to pick up the region and the language and kind of put it together, abstract it in the form of for use in localization. So this is another one of the other things that you really need to be careful with, that make sure that you don't build the design system for what you need now, but what you will need in the next few years.
Great. Sort of a corollary question when it comes to colors. So how do you deal with transparency? Is that ever an issue? Do things look different in different contexts that you don't expect?
In what way transparency? Sorry, may I ask?
Do you use colors with a transparency? If so, how do you deal with that situation?
Okay. I mean, it depends. So obviously, our main colors that we've laid out, like the categories that we showed, so background colors, divider colors, they're all just the actual hex codes. When we're building components, though, for example, like this scrim that darkens the screen when our modal sheet comes up is obviously going to be black, but with a level of transparency to it. And that's then defined in the actual component and not in the color. So we'll define the colors as always completely opaque. And then if we need to, in components, we can change the opacity.
Do you document motion, transitions, or timings?
Yeah, so this is one thing that's not part of this presentation, but we've kind of dubbed this the extended fundamentals. And there's 3 parts to those. One of them is haptics, so really documenting how to use haptics on each platform. Another one is sound, and another one is animation. Obviously, it gets pretty difficult from the very beginning to document every single part of motion if you haven't documented anything at all yet. So it kind of starts from a very grassroots kind of approach and just having duration, curve, those 2 things to at least have a fundamental of motion that can then be evolved into transitions and bigger parts.
Yeah, and once we have the extended fundamentals, and if you have a backend for a front end or some sort of middleware, not only would it not just return data, and not just UI, but it would be possible to return an entire user experience from a backend. So maybe that's the way to go, maybe not, we'll see.
How did you build the system glossary? Did you do it from scratch? Did you use any tools? And is there anything that people out there can find in open source?
It's just an application. It's another module, to go a bit more technical on the Android side of things. It's just an application module that is a different application, which depends on the design system, and then its only job is to display what is in the design system.
What are the largest conflicts that come up when you're using this system internally? Is it developers and designers? Is it somebody else?
I think, obviously, what's super difficult is when designers haven't used design systems before, is really proving the point as to why it's so valuable. And that's just discussions then, like actually explaining like what the benefits are. For a lot of people, when they see a design system, it can be quite daunting in a sense that it can seem just like a Lego set that you can't evolve anymore, and it's kind of like a design police. So really making sure that everyone is included from the get-go and is made sure that they can contribute kind of alleviates that kind of conflict. That they're not being told how to design, but it's like a framework that we can all work on.
Yeah, on the engineering side, we had the exact opposite problem. We had a lot of people, a lot of engineers wanting to contribute to the design system, but whatever they might be wanting to contribute may or may not be compliant with the design system, right? So you need to kind of funnel all of these efforts and all of this energy and all of these pieces of output, and making sure you only put the right things in the design system that belong there, and not everything that looks like it could be in the design system, but is not really.
Is there somebody who's actually driving that? Is there someone who's accountable, who gets to decide what's in or out? And especially a question around involving the brand team in that.
So when we first started a couple months ago, obviously we were, as a team, quite small. Like it was just 4 of us, and I was the only designer on the systems team. So what we kind of did was, I, as the systems designer, would talk to product and brand and lay out these fundamentals in collaboration with everyone. And now that we have these fundamentals laid out, we have these things called system sessions, where we can actually discuss what should be part of the design system, if anybody is building any components that might be basically a duplicate effort if 2 teams were to build it, and we just try and align on the things that should be included. And then that kind of ties back to this contribution model that Omkar was talking about, that if it is spec'd and then approved, that we can then add it to the design system.
And when you get feedback, how do you actually incorporate that into the system? Like, how do you make sure that you are testing all of these different components, but not just individually, but as a system overall? Yeah,
so that's one of the steps that we're going to take next. Like we will be introducing snapshot testing for each of the component that we build. So it's like unit testing a UI element in a way, so that you're making sure that it works by itself as it is. And then when you stack it up together, the espresso test or the integration test would essentially be very light and assert only if the right elements are stacked together, and not necessarily go into the details of each single element. It's still something that we have been thinking about, but haven't really formalized or concretized, and we might completely deviate going ahead, but in general, this is the direction that we are kind of headed in right now.
And what about user research or usability? Like, how do you manage that as well?
This comes a lot more from the actual product teams themselves. So because our systems team is super small, we're like kind of relying on the product teams themselves to test these things. So if they know that they want to build a component and they already have user testing lined up, that they can actually include the testing of these components into their actual research.
Yeah, and if that yields the need for a new component, like I said, in the contribution process, there needs to be a strong argument why we need these new components, and that includes some input from user research and the feature that they're building.
When it comes to participating in the system, how do you sort of manage that, and how do you make sure that it doesn't stifle innovation? How does someone feel that they, from another product team, can contribute just like the systems team can?
I mean, that comes kind of from these like weekly sessions that we have set up, or bi-weekly, which we like dubbed system sessions. So that's basically just a gathering of all of us product designers, or as many as can participate in any session, where we discuss what should be added. And that's kind of how we're trying to include everyone in this process, and not just keeping everything in this like bottleneck of a systems team that has to build everything themselves and like makes the decisions themselves. So we're trying to make it this federated model that everybody can contribute to.
Yeah, and it's also a bit of a project management topic, because sometimes you might have a lot of things that might need to go into the design system and is approved. Which one comes first? So then there's company priorities and feature priorities and all of these things which come in, and then it becomes more of a project than a product.
And there's a couple questions about platform consistency, and how do you decide when to go with your own version versus take something that's more of a standard on the platform? And then also inside different features, how you decide when to use something new or when to just go with the thing you've already got.
So obviously, we always talk about consistency, and you can see consistency as having it look identical across platform. But in a lot of cases, I think that's the worst decision than to actually be more platform specific. So for example, in this 3-item container that we showed, we have a version of it that has an icon, title, subtitle, and a toggle on the right. And the toggle on the right is then obviously specific for each platform. So it wouldn't make sense to have a very iOS-style looking toggle on an Android device. So even though these components are named the same as a toggle row, or whatever you want to call it, they'll actually render very platform-specific on each platform. And in these cases, when you want to reduce the learning curve, then just stick to something that's actually already embedded in native.
Yeah, and especially if you're a big player on the platforms, on iOS and Android, Google and Apple, both of them are really specific when it comes to featuring your apps, right? So you need to respect the platform-specific guidelines. So like Clemens said, the benefit of having your design system abstracted is this, that you can still respect the platform-specific guidelines, even though you're referring to the same thing.
There's a couple of questions specifically about dark mode, and Roy mentioned it as well. Is using a design system make it easier to keep up with these updates or more difficult?
I mean, as we're only like 6 months into this whole process, I think time will tell, obviously, but very specifically in this like dark mode topic, obviously, if we wanted to adapt iOS dark mode if we wouldn't have a system right now, it would take a lot more effort than if we had our colors already systemized like we do now. That said, obviously, it takes the effort of the whole company to actually then switch all of the colors to the system to allow this. But I think further down the line, when we also have a culture for collaboration and culture for contribution to the system, it'll speed things up.
And at what size would you recommend people actually start doing this in their own work?
That's a tough one. I'm doing it for my own personal project already. I'm the only developer, designer, product owner on it, but
I personally think the earlier the better. Obviously, it's super hard to like sell to management or like super high level in the company the value of it, because if you're not shipping anything valuable to the user, why would anybody care? But looking at how many products we've built now and where our apps are on each platform, I wish we could have started earlier, because it would just reduce the amount of debt you have. And you don't have to have like a full component library with 150 components in it. Even just systemizing color and typography is already a step in the right direction. And just having like these very fundamental things laid out.
And for someone who might go home and be inspired and start their own system at their own company, do you think that they should approach it incrementally? Should you try to like sort of kick off a big project? What tips do you have for implementing this in people's work lives?
I think it's also very dependent on the resources you have as a company. If you have the resources to actually throw a bunch of people at it, then potentially it's the right way to go to actually get the ball rolling very quickly. If the company is super small and it's like a really like early stage startup, I think it can all be done quite incrementally. Like I said, just laying out these fundamentals potentially on the first kind of product you're shipping, saying these are the colors we're going to be using, and we know that we'll use them in the future. Let's just systemize these and then actually use them, instead of just building them ad hoc for each product.
And what's maybe the biggest thing that you would have done differently, knowing what you know now?
I think it's a bit too early to say that. We just kicked it off over the last few months. But like Clemens said, I wish we would have started a bit earlier, but it's better late than never.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.